Religious hypocrisy. We are to worship God with sincere and pure hearts, avoiding meaningless rituals. Here now is Gene to explain.
Let me say, in relationship to this principle, there's nothing wrong with ritual. The problem is meaningless ritual. And that's what Amos is addressing here. Look at chapter 5, verse 21. God is speaking, and wow, he does not mince words. I despise your feasts. They were still engaging in the feasts that God gave them at Mount Sinai. The feasts of unleavened bread, the harvest feast, the Feast of Weeks it's called, the Feast of Tabernacles. They were still integrating that into their pagan behavior. We call that syncretism, syncretizing paganism with God's truth. And so God says, I despise your feasts. I can't stand the stench of your solemn assemblies. Even if you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. I will have no regard for your fellowship offerings of fattened cattle. In other words, they were still engaging in these offerings that God had instituted there at the foot of Mount Sinai, but they were doing it in the context of idolatry and immorality. Wow. And God's not happy because he goes on to say, take away from me the noise of your songs. I don't want you even singing. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice flow like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. What they were doing was just the opposite of that final statement, where he says, but let justice flow like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. Isn't it fascinating? When Jesus came into this world, he came as a Jew. He came to the Jew first. And he found the Pharisees. Now, they rejected idolatry, but they were still guilty of hypocrisy and ritual that was meaningless. Look at Luke chapter 11, Pharisaical hypocrisy, I call this. As he was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. I love that because Jesus didn't hesitate to dine with sinners, the worst of sinners. The hypocritical people looked down on him for that. He said, I have come for those who are sick. That's why I'll sit down at this table with this Pharisee. And when the Pharisee saw this, he was amazed that he did not first perform the ritual washing before dinner. And what Jesus is saying, that is just a ritual. And he purposely avoided it to get the question. But the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees, and he's now addressing all of them, they're looking on. Now you Pharisees, clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and evil. You're committed all this external stuff, all of this ritual, but inside you're like dead men's bones, white and sepulchres. That's what their rituals were like. It wasn't reflecting true godliness. And it's interesting that Paul warned against this kind of godless activity when he wrote to Timothy in his final letter, writing from that horrible cell where he was just about to die at the hand of Nero. And he said this, Timothy, but know this, difficult times will come in the last days. For people will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the form of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid these people. What he's talking about here is that there will be people who have this form of godliness, but it's not godly at all. And obviously here he would be talking about people who are unbelievers primarily, although it could have been those who are called Christians or called themselves Christians and who are living in sin. And he says, separate yourself from that kind of worldly behavior. So Applying this to our own lives, I raise this question: how can we avoid allowing our personal and corporate worship to become purely ritualistic or form without meaning? Nothing wrong with form, but we can have form without meaning that is godly. And we see this in the lives of the children of Israel. And so I think one way to avoid that is to raise this question: why do we do what we do? Are we doing it because we believe that this is something we should do because God wants us to do this in order to be saved? Or He wants us to do this so we just do it in order to please Him so that we don't get in trouble with Him? That's not the basis of true worship. It's our love for Him. It's our willingness, our desire to serve Him. I think another application is vain repetition. It's really sad. I've watched this in people who go through this vain repetition, where they go through their, almost like a prayer chain, as it were, thinking that as they go through this, that they'll receive forgiveness of sin. Isn't that sad? That's vain repetition. Or going through prayers again and again and again, saying this prayer in order to have redemption or forgiveness of sin. That's vain repetition. That's ritual. And you can see that it becomes ritual without meaning, with true meaning. Or even lighting candles, thinking that if we go through this ritual, we light candles for people who've died, thinking that this might bring them salvation. Meaningless ritual. And all of us as Christians can engage in meaningless ritual, even though we would not do the things I've just enumerated, but it's not a heart experience. So God wants our hearts. And let's also remember that in our worship, Jesus Christ is our only mediator. There's no one else that can take us to the Father except Jesus Christ. He is the one that forgives us and makes intercession for us before the Father. So let's avoid religious hypocrisy, as the principle states. We're to worship God with sincere and pure hearts, avoiding meaningless rituals.